Thank you for joining me again. We've got to the 17th part now of the life of Christ, and it's one of the really difficult bits. It's the crucifixion itself. Shall we start with a word of prayer? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Lord, may these words that you have put in your scriptures speak to our hearts. Amen. I'd like to start actually in the book of Leviticus. So if you can turn to Leviticus chapter 23, I've called this section the 4 festivals. And you'll see why as we go through the crucifixion. There's 4 festivals here that are fulfilled in the death of Jesus on the cross. So if we go to Leviticus 23, it's verses 1 to 14. The Lord spoke again to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, The Lord's appointed times, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed times are these. For 6 days' work may be done, but on the 7th day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation, and you shall do no manner of work. It is the Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings. These are the appointed times of the Lord's holy convocations, which you shall proclaim to the time appointed for them. In the 1st month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. Then, on the 15th day of the same month, there is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the 1st day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall do no laborious work. But of the 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. On the 7th day is a holy convocation, and you shall do no laborious work. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, When you enter the land which I am going to give you, and reap the harvest, you shall bring in a sheaf of first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord for you to be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Now on that day, when you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a lamb, one of the first year without defect, as a burnt offering to the Lord. Its grain offering shall be with 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering of fire to the Lord for a soothing aroma with its libations, 1/4 of a hin of wine. Until this same day, until you have brought in the offering to your God, you shall eat neither bread, nor roast grain, nor new growth. It is to be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwelling places. As we go through, I'll bring each different element of that, but understand that's where we're coming from. All those 4 festivals, including the Sabbath is a weekly festival, are fulfilled in the crucifixion of Jesus. Let's go to Exodus to start with. So it's Exodus chapter 12. We start off obviously with the Passover itself. It's Exodus chapter 12, and it's verses 5 and 6. This is Moses passing on the words of God to the people. And they've been told to bring in a lamb, and they have to come in on the 10th day. Anyway, your lamb shall be an unblemished male of a year old, and you shall take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. This lamb was to be taken into the house, each individual household, on the 10th day of the month, and it was to live with the household for 4 days, and they were to check it to see if there was any fault, any defects, anything wrong with it. If they could not find anything wrong with it, then it was counted worthy of being the sacrifice. If you consider Jesus, when he came in to the temple, it was actually on the 10th day of the month Nisan, that is when he cleansed the temple. That's when he cast out the people. And from that time until the time that he was crucified was 4 days. During that time, the Pharisees tried to catch him out, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Sanhedrin tried, the high priest tried, Pilate and Herod, both of those tried, and Pilate said, "I find no guilt in the man, nor does Herod your king." Pilate's wife came and told her husband, "Have nothing to do with this righteous man." Even Judas found Jesus innocent, because when he went back to give back the money, he said, "I have betrayed innocent blood." At every stage, people tried to find something wrong with Jesus, and none of them could find anything wrong with him. So, obviously, in human terms, he should have been released. In the terms of the Passover, that meant he was worthy to be the sacrifice. At this stage, we'll have there's two actually other people who, after this point, will also find Jesus innocent. One was the thief on the cross, and the other one was the centurion. So even to the end of his life, Jesus was found to be innocent of all the crimes that were put upon him. Let's go to Mark to start with. We'll start on the events of that day. We'll go to Mark, and it's 15. So it's Mark 15, and it's verse 21. So Jesus has now gone through the entire trial. Pilate has basically washed his hands of the whole affair, handed him over to the Jews and said he can be crucified. And now he's been led out from the Praetorium. So Mark 15, verse 21. Now Jesus had to carry his own, any condemned man had to carry his own cross through the streets. It was sort of a dead man walking type situation. In Jesus' case, he had already been scourged by the Roman whip. Now that didn't normally happen. If someone was going to be crucified, they were normally not in any way beaten or mistreated beforehand. Not because the Romans wanted to be nice, but because they wanted them to last as long as possible on the cross, for people to see them having a living death, if you like, on the cross. So they would not normally have been in any way mistreated. Now Pilate has already had Jesus scourged. Now the reason for that was actually, in a strange way, Pilate was trying to be kind. He thought by beating up Jesus, it would make the authorities happy and they'd be satisfied with that and leave him alone. And of course, the Roman scourge was not a nice thing. It's not a few whips on the back. The whip itself would go right around your body. It had little bits of metal attached in it, and the whip would then be wrenched off, and it would rip large chunks of skin and things off as it came. So by this stage, Jesus, his back, his whole body effectively, would already be a fairly bloodied mass. So to carry a wooden cross after what he'd gone through was already a pain and suffering. So, if you like, the Romans either take pity on him or they want to get it over quickly. But in verse 21, and they pressed into service a passerby coming in from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. The name is remembered because certainly Rufus, at the very least, became a Christian later on. And in the end of the book of Romans, he is one of the names that is mentioned in Paul's greetings to the people of Rome. So obviously the effect that this had on Simon's life must have meant that he, or at least his sons, came to become Christians. It's strange how, as you look at the death of Jesus, how it affected people around him who watched how he suffered. Let's go to Luke 23. Now there's much Catholic idea of the stations of the cross, and they say that different things happened at different places. There's not much of that mentioned in the Bible, and I'm only taking what's in the Bible. Let's go to Luke 23, and it's verse 27. One of the events we know happened as Jesus was walking in front with Simon carrying the cross behind. And there were, Luke 23, verse 27. And they were following him, a great multitude of people, and the women who were mourning and lamenting him. that was sort of the tradition, of very loud wailing and things. So whenever someone was going to die, there would be lots of, either they did die, or in this case were going to die, the women would come out and be wailing. It didn't necessarily mean they actually meant it or were sorry, but it was the traditional thing they used to do. And Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they shall say, Blessed are the barren of the womb, who never bore, and the breast that never gave nurse. And they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if these things were done in the green tree, what will happen in the dry?" And 2 others, who were criminals, were being led away to put to death with him. The expression there, if they do this thing in the green tree, what will they do in the dry? It's there's a Jewish idea of, if they do this to somebody who is innocent, what are they going to do to someone who is guilty? And in this particular case, the guilty person is Jerusalem. It is Jerusalem who gave Jesus up, who said, "Crucify him." And 40 years later, what indeed happens is the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans. The entire population are either slaughtered or crucified. No one escapes. And it is a particularly gruesome thing that happens. So basically Jesus is saying, if they're doing this to me as an innocent person, what are they going to do to Jerusalem as the guilty person in this? Let's go on to Matthew 27. We're going to be jumping between the Gospels quite a lot today to the different accounts. Each one has something slightly different to tell us. Matthew 27, and it's verse 34. Or 33 we'll start from. "And when they came to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, they gave him wine to drink, mingled with gall. And after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink." One of the other Gospels said he basically wouldn't drink it too. Obviously, they put it to his lips, he realised what it was, and he decided not to have any of it. Now, the gall, or I think it's a myrrh, is one of the other translations. It was almost like a drug. And the idea was to get you completely out of your skull before they drove the nails in. So I suppose partly as an act of pity, partly as an act of stopping the person fighting back quite so much. So they would try to get you drunk. Now Jesus, earlier on at the Last Supper, actually said that he would not drink again of the fruit of the wine at this stage. And he didn't drink, I don't think he actually drank any of the wine during the Last Supper itself, because he needed his mind completely sharp. And the same here. Jesus does not drink the wine because he wants his mind sharp, and he does not want to deaden what is going to come. He needs his wits about him. So even here, Jesus takes the full punishment in order to keep his mind clear for what is needed. Now that phrase there, mingled with gall, also comes in one of the Psalms. And the Psalms play quite a big bit in the crucifixion. Let's go to Psalm 69. I'm going to read this whole psalm, and as I read through, hopefully you'll see the relevance of it. So it's Psalm 69. "Save me, O God, for the waters have threatened my life. I have sunk deep into the mire, and there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood overflows me. I am weary of my crying, my throat is parched. My eyes fail while I wait for my God. Those who hate me without cause are more than the hairs of my head. Those who would destroy me are powerful, being wrongfully my enemies. What I did not steal, I have been made to restore. O God, it is thou who dost know my folly, and my wrongs are not hidden from thee. May those who wait for thee not be ashamed through me. O Lord God of hosts, may those who seek me not be dishonoured through me, O God of Israel. Because for thy sake I have borne reproach. Dishonour has covered my face. I have become estranged from my brothers and aliens to my mother's sons. For zeal of thy house has consumed me. and the reproach of those who reproach thee has fallen on me. Remember, the zeal of thy house has consumed me. That's what the disciples remembered after the first time Jesus cleansed the temple. Basically, the zeal of your house has destroyed me, and that's the charge they brought against Jesus, that he was willing to destroy the temple and bring it back in 3 days. So that's the unrighteous charge they brought against him. Back to verse 10. When I wept in my soul with fastings, it became my reproach. When I made sackcloth my clothing, I became a byword to them. Those who sit in the gate talk about me. I am the song of the drunkards. But as for me, my prayer is to thee, O Lord, at an acceptable time, O God, in the greatness of thy loving kindness, answer me with thy saving truth. Like that, at an acceptable time. Remember, Jesus said, not my will, but thine. He's praying for salvation, but in God's timing, not his own. Verse 14. Deliver me from the mire, and do not let me sink. May I be delivered from my foes, and from the deep waters. May the floods of water not overflow me, and may the deep not swallow me up, and may the pit not shut its mouth over me. So here Jesus knows he is going into the grave, but he's praying that the grave does not swallow him and close on him forever. Answer me, O God, for thy loving kindness is good. According to the greatness of thy compassion, turn to me, and do not hide thy face from thy servant. For I am in distress. Answer me quickly. O draw near to my soul and redeem me. Ransom me because of my enemies. Thou dost know my reproach, and my shame, and my dishonour. All my adversaries are before thee. Reproach has broken my heart, and I am sick. And I look for sympathy, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. They have given me gall for my food, and from my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. May their table before them become a snare, and when they are in peace, may it become a trap. May their eyes grow dim so they cannot see, and make their loins shake continually. Pour out thine indignation on them, and may thy burning anger overtake them. May their camp be desolate, and may none of their dwell in their tents. For they have persecuted him who thou thyself hast smitten. Here Jesus, or David prophesying basically, is saying that God has smitten Jesus, but they are adding persecutions on top of what God has done. Halfway through 26, and they tell of the pains of those who thou hast wounded. Do thou add iniquity to their iniquity, and may they not come to thy righteousness. May they be blotted out from the book of life, and may they not be recorded with righteousness. But I am afflicted and in pain. May thy salvation, O God, set me securely on high. I will praise the name of God with song, and shall magnify him with thanksgiving. And it will please the Lord better than an ox or a young bull with horns and hooves. This obviously is a sacrifice. So here David's speaking about a sacrifice. So his praise is better than sacrifice as far as God is concerned. Verse 32. The humble have seen it and are glad. You who seek God, let your hearts revive, for the Lord hears the needy and does not despise his who are prisoners. Let the heavens and earth praise him, the sea and everything that is it moves within it. For God will save Zion and build the city of Judah, that he may dwell there and possess it. And the descendants of his servants will inherit it, and those who love his name will dwell in it. I hope you see the relevance of that psalm to what happens to Jesus here. Obviously, you might have a strange thing here, that it seems that David here is asking for judgment on his enemies. In a minute, we're going to see the first thing that Jesus says on the cross is, Father, forgive them. I think he was saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. That will be the people who are crucifying him, not the people who did know what they were doing. So that would be the high priests, that would be the Sanhedrin, that would be Herod, that would be Pilate, those people who knew that they were doing wrong, that they were killing an innocent man. As far as the soldiers who were doing it, they were just doing their job. They didn't know one way or the other. Jesus was praying for forgiveness for them, not for those who were against them. At this time as well, it talks about the table. If I find the exact word. May their table be a snare to them, I believe it said. At this moment, when Jesus is being led out to be crucified, it's at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, this was the day of Passover itself. The night before, you would have had the Passover meal, where a lamb would have been sacrificed, and each family would eat of that lamb. But in the morning, there was another sacrifice. The lamb itself was first of all led out at dawn and was tethered to the altar, and that would be about 6 o'clock-ish. That was the same time that Jesus was handed over to the Romans. And then at 9 o'clock, that lamb would actually be sacrificed. And that was the time that Jesus was actually nailed to the cross. Now, that lamb itself was a special one. It was one that was personally chosen by the high priest. And there would be a meal that day. And that meal would be just for the high priest and the 24 chief priests of the 24 orders of priesthood. And that would be a specific sacrifice that only they would have partaken of. And that's one of the reasons that the high priest and the others didn't want to go into Pilate's house, because that would have made them ceremonially unclean, and they could have not have partaken of that meal. So at the time that Jesus is actually being crucified, the high priest would have legged it back to the temple. They would have carried this sacrifice, and they would probably be enjoying their meal, probably somewhat hastily. As we will see later on, they're going to run back to take the mickey out of Jesus. But it's interesting that this psalm should say, may their table become a snare to them. They think they are being saved by this special sacrifice. In fact, it's not. This sacrifice is catching them out. Let's go to John. John 19. John 19, it's verse 19 to 22. Actually, let's start from verse 16. So John 19, verse 16. So they delivered him to them to be crucified. And they took Jesus, therefore, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. And there they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus in between. Now, what I found when I was reading all the accounts, that you almost read over that bit, and they crucified him, without even thinking about it, and just carry on to the next section. Now, one of the reasons that none of the Gospels give any graphic details, if you like, is because everybody at that stage in the Roman Empire knew exactly what a crucifixion was like. And it wasn't something you particularly wanted to bear in mind. The way it would normally work, there were 4 different types of crosses. Some was literally just a pole. Some of them was an X shape. There was a sort of capital T type shape, where basically you would just carry the cross beam, and then the cross beam would be slotted onto a pole already in the ground. Then there was the lowercase t shape, which is the one we traditionally see as the cross. That's most likely the one that Jesus was crucified on. The reason we know that is because the wording for his accusation was placed above his head. If it was the capital T type cross, there would be nowhere above the head for the accusation to be placed. So the traditional cross is probably the correct one. Once they got them there, the cross would be put on the floor. The person would normally be got as drunk as they could manage. Then they would have forced him down onto the cross. Nails would be driven not through the palms of the hands, because that would not hold the weight, but actually through the wrist, where the 2 bones of the upper arm come together. There's a hole in between. That's where the nails were driven through. There'd normally be a sort of wooden washer, if you like, on the outside, and the nail driven through. On the feet, there was, on the base of the cross, there was a small ledge for the feet to rest upon. Now, this wasn't being nice to the person who was on the cross. This was actually to make their suffering last longer, as we'll see later on. But the legs would be crossed over, possibly moved to one side, and now would be driven through both feet, probably straight through the bones themselves on the feet to the cross. It may well be the person would be tied as well down before these nails were driven in. Obviously, at this point, the person would be screaming their head off, possibly swearing and shouting. It was even known for Roman soldiers sometimes to cut the tongue out of the person who they were crucifying because they couldn't cope with the shouting and the swearing and things like that. Once that had been done, then the cross was actually pulled upright. And there would be a slot in the ground, a hole in the ground, and as it got higher and higher, all the weight would be taken onto the arms. And when the cross eventually fell into that hole, what would normally happen is that the arm sockets would be dislocated. And so the body would then be hanging from the muscles and the sinew, and the bones of the arm on both sides would be dislocated. In the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the bread itself, we've talked about the bread in the past, it had to be leavenless, it had to be sinless bread. It had to have stripes on it to show how quickly it had been cooked. It had to be pierced, to have holes through it, to show that, once again, that it hadn't had time to leaven. But one of the most important things is it had to be broken. It was counted as wrong to take a knife to unleaven bread. It had to be broken. And that is what happened to Jesus' body on the cross. His body was broken. It was, as it were, if you like, pulled out of its sockets. It was pulled limb from limb. And it would be at the point that happened, when the cross fell in that hole, that limbs were that person up there, if they still had a tongue, would let loose every curse and swear word they could think of. They would curse the people who did it. They would curse the people who accused them. They would shout at God. They would shout at everything else. That is the point that Jesus said, Father, forgive them. Forgiving the people who'd just done that to him. No wonder he affected lives around him. Let's go on in John 19. So to verse 19. So John 19, verse 19. And Pilate wrote an inscription also, and put it on the cross, and it was written, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, it's always traditional that an accusation against the man be put on there, so everybody would know this is a murderer, this is a thief, this is a rapist, whatever it happened to be, so that everybody could look at it. But this, if you look at it, is not an accusation. It's a title. And it was a title, and if you read down below, it's written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. And along come the chief priest, in verse 21. And so the chief priests and the Jews were saying to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but he said, I am the King of the Jews. They want to change it to an accusation. But Pilate's not having any of that. And Pilate said, what I have written, I have written. Now the reason for that is a little way before, in the same chapter, in verse 15. When Pilate's trying to release the people, and he brings Jesus out, and he says, behold your king. And verse 15, and they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priest answered, we have no king but Caesar. So Pilate, it's a bit of revenge, if you like, for the pressure they've been putting on him. I am crucifying your king. Not that he said he's your king, but I am crucifying your king. So this is Pilate's little bit of revenge here. He'll have a little bit more later on. But spiritually speaking, it's not an accusation, it's a title. Jesus was the King of the Jews. He is still the King of the Jews. It's interesting in that Psalm 69 that we read, although he calls for vengeance on those who have knowingly been his enemies for no cause. At the end of it, it talks about the redemption of Judah and Jerusalem. And so Jesus is still the King of the Jews. Now, there are 7 statements that Jesus makes from the cross. We've already covered the first one. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. In John still, let's see what happens after that. So John 19:23. The soldiers, therefore, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments and made 4 parts to every soldier, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. And they said, therefore, to one another, let's not tear it, but let's cast lots to decide whose it shall be. That the scripture might be fulfilled, they divided my outer garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now, normally I suspect that the soldiers would probably have sold off the clothing from a condemned man. Whether in this particular case they could, because of what happened, the scourging of Jesus already, I would imagine these clothings were particularly covered in blood. So whether they just intended to use them as rags for cleaning their uniforms, who knows. But once again, we go back to the Psalms, to Psalm 22 in this case. This is going to be a very important psalm in the crucifixion of Jesus. We'll come back to it again later on as well. So Psalm 22, verse 16, just to start with. For dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers have encompassed me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look, they stare at me. And remember, after the scourging, it's quite likely that Jesus' bones would have shown through his flesh. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. We'll come back to Psalm 22 later on. But that, as you can see, is fulfilled in what the soldiers do here. In John again, 19 verse 25. One of the responsibilities of an elder son was to look after his mother. And Jesus now is aware of his responsibility to his mother. His mother is standing within speaking distance of the cross. Can you imagine how awful that must have been? Verse 25. Therefore, the soldiers did these things, but there was standing by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. And he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her into his own household. Now it said that this disciple he loved, this was the same disciple who had been, as it were, leaning on Jesus' breast, as the expression is, in the Last Supper. It's the author of the book, whom we believe to be the Apostle John. And you notice he's the only apostle that came to the crucifixion of Jesus. None of the others were there. Neither was Jesus' brothers there. Normally, I guess it would have passed on to the next oldest brother to look after his mother. But the brothers had not come. Their mother was there, their sister and others looking after her. So Jesus basically asks John to adopt, or Mary to adopt John, and for John to adopt Mary into his family. And that is what happened, and according to church tradition. I think they moved to Ephesus or somewhere like that when they have to leave the Holy Land. So here's Jesus. The first thing he thinks of is forgiveness. The second thing he thinks of is his duty towards his mother. Let's go back to Matthew. Matthew 24. It's verse 38. Now in the notes, I've written this down as Satan's last throw. And I'll read it and then I'll explain to you. So Matthew 24, verse 38 to 44. And at that time 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those passing by were hurling abuse at him and wagging their heads and saying, You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself, if you are the Son of God. come down from the cross. In the same way, the chief priests also along with the scribes and the elders, were mocking him, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down, and we will believe, and from the cross, and we shall believe him. He trusts in God. Let him deliver him now, if he takes pleasure in him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And the robbers also, who had been crucified with him, were casting insults at him. Now, why do I say this is Satan's last throw? The reason is this. Satan wanted Jesus dead. And he had been trying all his life, right from the first time when he incited Herod to slaughter the children. He wanted Jesus dead. And he was trying to get the Pharisees to do it. He was trying to get the Sanhedrin to do it. He was trying to get anybody he could, the crowds in Nazareth, to throw him off the ship. But Satan wanted him dead at any time, apart from at the Passover. And in any place apart from Jerusalem. Because Satan knows his Bible quite well. And he would understand what God was talking about on here. He wouldn't be able to comprehend it, but he would understand the prophecies about a lamb being offered at Passover for the forgiveness of the people. And he had been, as it were, pushing at this mighty boulder, which is the Jewish people, to get them moving in the direction he wanted them to go. But unfortunately unfortunately for him, Jesus started the rock rolling when he didn't want it. The Sanhedrin themselves had decided not to crucify Jesus at the Passover, which was obviously Satan's bidding, but Jesus himself had started the process going by sending Judas out to betray him at this time. And the rock, as it were, started rolling, and Satan didn't want it to roll because it was taking Jesus exactly where he needed to be, on the cross, to die for the forgiveness of sins. And that is not what Satan wanted under any circumstances. And now he's desperately trying to backpedal to, as it were, stop Jesus dying on the cross. And so here is the temptation, the same temptation that Satan used in the wilderness. Right at the beginning, when Jesus was 40 days in the wilderness, he said to Jesus, throw yourself down from the top of the temple and everybody will see you and believe in you, because the angels will carry you down. What he's saying to Jesus now through these people is, you call on those 12 legions of angels you claim you have backing you up. Let them come down. Let them bring you off this cross. Let them bring you down, and everybody can see, and you can get what you want. You can be accepted as the King of the Jews if you call on these angels now. But if you remember in the psalm, Jesus said, at an acceptable time, when he's speaking to God, at an acceptable time, please save me. Jesus is not fooled by this. He recognises the voice of Satan through the chief priests, through the people who are shouting, even through the robbers on either side of him shouting at him. And he bears it. And he bears it for 3 hours. And once again, the people observing the suffering of Jesus, the effect it has on them. If we go to Luke, someone who was observing the suffering of Jesus more than anybody else at that point. Luke 23 and verse 39. And this is one of the criminals who, to start with, had been hurling abuse at him. And one of the criminals who was hanged with him was hurling abuse at him, saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other answered and rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. Is another person who found Jesus innocent. And he was saying, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he, that's Jesus, said to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So amazingly, Jesus put up with all that abuse, and here is as it were, the very thing for which he's hanging there for, that someone who is guilty may be saved by what Jesus is going through. I suspect this happened getting on towards 12 o'clock. So Jesus has, in the morning, the high priest obviously went and had their sacrifice, and they rushed back, and they've been standing there hurling abuse at him just to make sure he's been crucified properly. Probably the criminals were abusing him in the morning, and this is just coming up to 12 o'clock. And something happens at 12 o'clock. That is the most terrifying thing of all, as far as Jesus is concerned. So in Luke again, chapter 23, 44. And now, about the 6th hour, that's the 6th hour after dawn, so this is midday, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. That would be 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was being obscured, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. So total darkness over the land. Let's go to Zephaniah, chapter 1. And it's verse 14 to verse 14 to 18. So Zephaniah, chapter 1, 14 to 18. This is a description of events that will happen in the future, towards the end, towards the second coming. Near is the great day of the Lord, near and coming very quickly. Listen, the day of the Lord. In it the warrior cries out bitterly. A day of wrath is the day, a day of trouble and distress, a day of destruction and desolation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpets and battle, and the cries against the fortified city, and the high corner towers. And I will bring distress on men, so that they will walk like the blind, because they have sinned against the Lord, and their blood will be poured out like dust, and their flesh like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold will deliver them on the day of the Lord's wrath, and all the earth will be devoured in the fire of his jealousy, and he will make a complete end, indeed a terrifying one, for all the inhabitants of the earth. That is a description of the wrath of the God on sinners at the second coming. In this darkness, what we see is the wrath of God on Jesus. Because at this point, Jesus has now taken on the sins of all who will believe on him. At this point, Jesus becomes the most sinful man on the world ever. He has taken my sins and your sins. And as the song says, God has to turn his face away. God has to black out the heavens. And all the wrath of God, talks about the cup of the wrath of God, Jesus drinks it all to the very dregs. The punishment for sins. Here God is pouring it out upon Jesus. Let's go to Matthew 27. Matthew 27, it's 45. Verse 45. Now from the 6th hour, darkness fell on all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of those who were standing by, when they heard it, began saying, this man is calling for Elijah. You see, Eli is the shortened version of the name Elijah. And immediately one of them ran, taking a sponge and filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed and gave him to drink. But the rest of them said, let us see whether Elijah comes down and saves him. Obviously, these people have been listening to what the priests and everything were saying. The important thing about this particular thing, firstly, it comes at the end of this 3 hours of darkness. You would imagine when God turned his face away from Jesus, that Jesus might have shouted it at the beginning, but Jesus knew what was going to happen. And so he endured it all until the end. And coming up to the end of the time, he says these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? One of the important things to notice here is that Jesus calls God, my God, which might sound a bit normal, except Jesus had never, when speaking directly to his Father, called him anything else than Father or my Father. This is the only time recorded in Scripture that Jesus refers to his Father as my God. So at this point, Jesus had been rejected as a son. Also, though, in the Jewish reckoning, these particular words come from a psalm. In Jewish understanding, because they didn't have chapters and verses and things in those days, if they wanted to refer to a particular psalm or book or anything like that, they only had to say the first few words of it, sometimes the first word of it, and everybody would know what psalm or what book they were talking to. Let's go to Psalm 22. By the words that Jesus said here, he is claiming this whole psalm. And so the words that he had not got time to say, if you like, on the cross, or the energy to say, by claiming those words, he is saying this whole psalm. So it's Psalm 22. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. My God, I cry by the day, but thou dost not answer, and by night, but I have no rest. Yet thou art holy, O thou who art enthroned beyond the praises of Israel, upon the praises of Israel, In thee our fathers trusted, and they trusted, and thou didst deliver them. To thee they cried out, and they were delivered. In thee they trusted, and were not disappointed. But I am a worm, and not a man, a reproach of men, and despised by the people. All who see me sneer at me. They separate their lips, they wag their heads, saying, Commit yourself to the Lord. Let him deliver you, let him rescue you, because he delights in you. That's exactly the same thing the high priest said to him. So even the high priests were quoting this psalm. Verse 9. Yet thou art he, bring me forth from the womb. Thou didst make me trust upon my mother's breasts. Upon thee I was cast from birth. Remember when God had to save Jesus when Herod was trying to kill the children? Thou hast been my God from my mother's womb. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me, strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. That was a expression talking about great leaders, strong leaders. They open their mouths at me as a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melting within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue cleaves to my jaws. And thou dost lay me in the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierce my hands and my feet. I can count my bones. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and from my clothes they cast lots. But thou, O Lord, be not far off. O thou, my help, hasten to my assistance. Deliver my soul from the sword, my own life from the power of the dogs. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horn of the wild oxen thou dost answer me. I will tell of thy name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly I will praise thee. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, glorify him. And stand in awe of him, all you descendants of Israel, for he will not despise nor abhor the affliction of the afflicted, neither has he hidden his face from him. And when he cries to him for help, he is heard. From thee comes my praise in the great assembly. I shall pay my vows before those who fear him. The afflicted shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise him. Let your hearts live forever. At the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before the King. For the kingdoms is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth will eat and worship, and all those who go down to the dust will bow before him. Even he who cannot keep his soul alive. Prosperity will serve him. It will be told of the Lord to the coming generations, and they will come and will declare his righteousness to a people who will be born, that he has performed it. And it will be declared his righteousness to a people who will be born. That's us. That's us. The righteousness of God was fulfilled, and it has been declared to us. Let's go to John chapter 19, verse 28. So when Jesus called out that, my God, why has you forsaken me? It's not despair, because, as it were, the job has been done. But he's claiming that psalm, and he's claiming the hope at the end of that psalm, and the trust in God that he will be delivered. Now after this, I'm in John chapter 19 and verse 28. Now after this, knowing that all things had already been accomplished, in order that the scripture might be fulfilled, he said, I thirst. Now what happens at this stage is someone runs up and puts a sponge on the end of a long stick, puts some, once again, the vinegar wine, and puts it up to his lips, and Jesus drinks. Now there's two things here. Firstly, he's drinking obviously because he is thirsty. But if we go to Luke chapter 16. Keep your fingers in John, because we'll be coming back there. Luke chapter 16. This is in the story that Jesus told of the rich man and Lazarus. And if you remember the story, there was a poor beggar called Lazarus outside the door, and a rich man inside who was enjoying his life and not paying any attention to the poor man. Both die. The rich man goes to hell, and Lazarus goes to what's described as Abraham's bosom, which is, in that sense, heaven. So Luke chapter 16 is verse 25. And here's the rich man calling out. Oh, sorry, verse 23, sorry. This is the rich man calling out when he sees Abraham. And in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being tormented, and saw Abraham afar away, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames. In some way, when Jesus says, I thirst, he's referring back to that. Jesus had suffered the flames of hell on the cross. For those 3 hours, from midday to 3 o'clock, Jesus had been literally going through the flames of hell. And here, in this particular case, fortunately, someone does bring relief to him. So that's what Jesus is referring back to there. But also, Jesus wants his voice to be heard for what's coming next. And so he needs to wet his throat for what he needs to say next. And in Matthew, it says that Jesus shouted out with a loud voice. Now, I heard a minister once. He was visiting a hospital and talking to a doctor. And in one of the wards, someone was shouting out at the top of their lungs, I'm dying, I'm dying, I'm dying. And the minister sort of said, well, shouldn't you go and see that person? And the doctor just smiled and said, if they were dying, they wouldn't be shouting out like that. When people die, they die with a whimper. They don't die with a shout. So the fact that Jesus is at this point shouting out with a loud voice shows that, physically speaking, he was not near his end. So that when Jesus dies later on, it is not because his body has given up, but it is because he has chosen that time to die. And the question is, what did he actually shout? And back to John, and it's chapter 19, and it's verse 30. And when Jesus therefore had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up the spirit. It is finished. That word in the Greek, I think it's tetelestai. It actually appears a few verses before in John, verse 28, in fact, chapter 19, verse 28. And it says, in my version, it says, "After this." Now that word "after this" is actually the same word, tetelestai. It is translated, "it is finished." Also, "it is completed," or "after this." It's the idea that something is completed, something is finished. So Jesus, knowing all things had already been accomplished. So by 28, the sins of the world had been paid for. Jesus had taken 3 hours of the wrath of God, and he had drunk the cup of the wrath of God and drained it. And now, basically, he wants to make sure it is known. So he takes the sip of wine and he shouts out as loud as he can, "It is finished." That particular word as well is also used in an accounting sense. The archaeologists have actually found tablets with the accounts from that period, and it shows how much somebody owed and what they've paid. Once it had been completely paid, the word tetelestai was actually written across the account. Basically, it has been completed, it is finished, the debt has been paid in full. So when Jesus shouted that out, our debt, was paid in full. The last thing that Jesus said is in Luke 23. Luke 23 and it's 46. "And Jesus cried out with a loud voice and said, 'Father, into your hands I commit your spirit.' And having breathed his last," and having said that, he breathed his last. Once again, it's the strong voice. It's not the voice of a man whose body is given up, but it's the voice of a man who is giving his spirit back to his Father. And you notice, "my Father." At the beginning, he said, "my God." During those 3 hours, when God had turned his back on him. But now, it is "my Father." And he's given his spirit back into his Father's hands. Go to Matthew 27, and it's verse 54. "And there was obviously one man standing by whose job it was to guard these prisoners. It was the centurion who was in charge. And if he was a centurion, then he'd been in the army for many a long year. He had watched a lot of men die. He has killed a lot of men. He would have crucified a lot of men." Verse 54. "Now the centurion and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that had happened," I forgot to say this, let's go a bit further back. There's actually bits in Matthew that aren't covered in the others. Go back to verse 50. So chapter 27, verse 50. "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn from the top to the bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split." It's interesting, in Luke it says that the veil in the temple was torn when it became dark. And here it's torn at the end. I wonder if this was an ongoing process, rather than one big rip, that God slowly started to tear it at the beginning of that darkness, and by the end of it finished it. The veil of the temple, by the way, is an enormous thing, great big curtain that hung in front of the Holy of Holies. It was supposed to be 4 inches thick, and it was torn from the top to the bottom. So not from the bottom to the top, not that anybody could have torn that much from the bottom to the top, but from the top where only God could reach, and torn from the top to the bottom. A slow, deliberate tearing. That had separated God and man was now ripped forever. Verse 52, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. This is referring to an event that, this is the only case we have to it. A lot of the tombs, this earthquake that hit, obviously moved the stones away from a lot of these tombs. And so that later on, when Jesus rose from the dead, so did many of those who had believed on him in the last 3 years of his ministry and died during that time. And those people rose at the same time that Jesus rose. Now, verse 54. Now the centurion and those who were with him, keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that happened, became very frightened and said, truly, this was the Son of God. Another translation of that, this was a Son of God. Remember, the Romans and the Greeks had many legends of the gods having children with men, demigods, Hercules and the like. And obviously that's what they would have grown up with. They wouldn't necessarily have known any of the Jewish traditions and wouldn't have accepted the idea of only there being one God. But certainly these men who crucified Jesus watched the way he died, and it affected them. And the forgiveness that Jesus had prayed for them for the act they did undoubtedly came into here. They saw it. Whether any of them became Christians afterwards, who knows? Verse 55. And many women were looking on from a distance, those who had followed Jesus from Galilee to minister to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene, along with Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. The ladies who stood on the, obviously many of the pictures we have Jesus, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene and others standing at the foot of the cross. At this stage they were all at a distance. Whether Mary had left at this stage, been taken away. But at this stage they were away from the cross. We know obviously Mary the mother of Jesus was there. It also says that Mary's sister was there. There's another Mary, Mary the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. There were lots of Marys in those days. Actually, the proper name is Miriam. That would be the proper name that has been sort of anglicised as it's come over to us here. One of the other Gospels, though, it talks about Salome, the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So it's possible that Mary's sister was actually this Salome, or Shulamite in Hebrew. So there is a possibility that James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were actually Jesus' cousins. Also, we have Mary, the wife of Cleopas, in one Gospel. Another one, it talks about Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. This is James, one of the other disciples, because there were two Jameses in the disciples. So at least two of the mothers of Jesus' disciples were standing at the foot of the cross. But there were also many other women who had come from Galilee. Literally, for Passover, whole villages would almost up and walk to Jerusalem together. And so for the Last Supper, many of these people would have been there at the Last Supper as well. Now we have the final feast. So we've had two feasts so far. We've had the Passover, the innocent lamb that was sacrificed. And by the way, there was a second sacrifice on the day. There was a morning sacrifice at 9 o'clock. There was an evening sacrifice at 3 o'clock. And that was the time that Jesus died, at 3 o'clock. So he was nailed to the cross at the time of the morning sacrifice. He died at the time of the evening sacrifice. We have the unleavened bread, the body, the sinless, pierced, striped body of Jesus broken on the cross. Let's go to John 19 again, a famous event. John 19, 31. The Jews, therefore, because it was the day of preparation, the next day being a Sabbath, so the day before is also the day of preparation for the Sabbath. So they've had 2 days of preparation. One was the preparation for the Passover, where Jesus had the meal in the evening. And now this is the next day, and they're now preparing for the Sabbath. So that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, they asked Pilate that the legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Now the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other man who was being crucified with Jesus. But coming to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, and they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately there came out blood and water. And he who was seen has borne witness, and his witness is true, and he knows what he is telling, that he is telling the truth, so that you may also believe. For these things came to pass, that the scripture might be fulfilled, that not a bone of him shall be broken. If you remember earlier on, I talked about the cross. They had a little wooden ledge for the person to stand on. That wasn't out of kindness. That was to increase the length of the suffering of the person on the cross. Because what would happen, as you were hanging down, you would be unable to breathe. So in order to take a breath, what you would have to do is push up on your feet. And if you can imagine, if your arms were dislocated at this stage, by pulling on the muscles, imagine the pain of that. So every breath would be an ongoing pain. If you didn't push up, though, you would suffocate. So obviously the body's natural desire to survive would mean you would suffer the pain and keep pushing yourself up. What they want to do here, because the Jews don't want nasty bodies hanging around on their Sabbath, they've asked for the legs to be broken, which means that the person cannot push up on their legs anymore, and they would then suffocate to death. So they were not asking for a kindness here, for putting them out of their misery, because that would just be stick a spear in the side. That would put you out of your misery. Though this would make them suffer even more to the point of death. So both the criminals on either side have their legs broken, and they die. Jesus, on the other hand, is seen to be dead. And no the Roman soldier will be held responsible if he didn't make sure that Jesus was dead. So he gets his spear, sticks it in the side, and he waits to see, does the blood spurt out? If the blood spurts out, then Jesus has literally just fainted, and they would break his legs and let him suffocate. But the blood runs out, which means that he has died, and they would know the difference. They'd killed enough men, they knew the difference between a dead man and a live man. So the stories that Jesus only fainted on the cross and come back afterwards that some people have come up with is not valid, because a Roman soldier would know his business. And if he took a man down that wasn't dead, he would have to answer for it, possibly with his own life. Now we have the blood and the water coming out. Now, I think Christians recently have become a little bit embarrassed about the Victorian concept of the blood of Christ. If you remember some of the old wonderful sayings, have you been washed in the blood of the Lamb, brother? And there's power in the blood. I think nowadays we're a little bit embarrassed about those. But the importance of this is beyond explaining, really. Let's go to Genesis to start with. It's always worth going back to Genesis to see where something is first mentioned, because quite often that sets the seal on how something will be interpreted for the rest of the Bible. And the first time blood as such is mentioned in the Bible is Genesis 4, and it's verse 10. So Genesis chapter 4, verse 10. This is after Cain has killed Abel. Or let's go from 9, shall we? Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said to him, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? And God said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. So the first mention of blood here is as an accusation. The blood has been spilt, and it is accusing you of the crime. Let's go to Hebrews now and see the difference of the blood of Christ compared to the blood of, the blood of all humanity. But Hebrews 12, the writer of Hebrews here is referring to this event. Hebrews 12, and it's verse 22. And this is the writer describing to the listeners what is happening in their lives now. But you have come to the Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to the myriads of angels to the general assembly of the church of the firstborn, who are enthralled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkling of blood that speaks better than the blood of Abel. The blood of Abel was crying out for justice. It was crying out for judgment. The blood of Jesus, the sprinkling of the blood of Jesus, is crying out for mercy. That sprinkling of the blood as well. Let's go back to Exodus. Events that happen at the giving of the law. It's Exodus and it's 24. Moses has been up to Mount Sinai. He's been given the Ten Commandments. He's been given the tablets of stone. Or not the tablets of stone at this stage, sorry. He's been given the law. He's written it down in a book. And he's read it out to the people. So it's Exodus chapter 24 and it's verse 5 to 8. And he, this is Moses, set young men of the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrifices and young bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in a basin, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And he took the book of the covenant and he read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all the Lord has spoken we will do and will be obedient. So Moses took the blood and he sprinkled it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So the blood of the covenant was the blood that was sprinkled on the people when the covenant was made. So the blood of Jesus, when the new covenant has been made, has been sprinkled on his people. So if you are a Christian today, the blood of Jesus Christ has been sprinkled on you. You have been sealed with the blood of Christ. Let's go to Romans. Book of Romans, and it's chapter 5. It's verse 8. So Romans 5, 8 and 9, in fact. But God demonstrated his love towards us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. It's the justification is by the spreading of Jesus' blood, or spilling of Jesus' blood. The blood that represents life was poured out, and it's that blood that, as it were, is sealed upon us. One last verse. I could have chosen thousands almost. Let's go to Revelations. Revelations 12, and it's verse 10. So Revelations 12 verse 10. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, here we've got another loud voice, a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation of the power and the kingdom of God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accusers of our brethren has been thrown down, who accused them before our God day and night. And they have overcome him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimonies, and they did not love their life even to death. Satan here is overthrown by the blood of the Lamb. What Satan feared happened, and he has been defeated because of the blood of Jesus Christ that was spread on that cross. The other thing, obviously, when the soldier put the spear in Jesus' side, it also said that water came out. If you can remember, we won't turn to it, but in the wilderness, when the people are thirsty, and God tells Moses to go to the rock and to strike it with his staff, and water came out. The wording there literally is, it says in our version, and God will stand on the rock. The probably more literal version is God will stand in the rock. So here, that spear going in the side is the equivalent of Moses' staff striking the rock, and the water of life comes out. That water of life for us. What happens, once again we won't turn to it, but in Luke, when the multitudes see what's going on, And this will probably be the normal people, not the people who have organised this, not the people who were at the trial of Jesus calling for his crucifixion, but the normal people who respected Jesus. It says when they saw what happened, they beat their breasts and they went back sorrowful to Jerusalem when they saw what was happening. Now, there's a character called Joseph of Arimathea who comes into the scripture for the first time here, and the Bible honours him. It honours him because he's mentioned in all four Gospels. Joseph of Arimathea, we know from Matthew that he was a rich man, and he had a rich man's tomb. It's interesting that in Isaiah 53, that famous passage about the lamb being led to the slaughter, it says that when the suffering servant there is honoured because he is put into a rich man's tomb. In Mark, it describes Joseph of Arimathea as a courageous man. It said he gets his courage together till he goes up to Pilate. Now, he's not afraid of Pilate, but Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the Sanhedrin. He is a Pharisee, and he has been a secret disciple all this time. And now he is actually plucking up courage at this point to declare his belief in Jesus, his respect for Jesus. I think sometimes we don't know what we have until we've lost it. And I think Joseph of Arimathea must have seen how much he respected Jesus upon his death. And now he is willing to give up, to risk everything that beforehand he wasn't. When Jesus was alive, he wasn't willing to risk his reputation and everything else. Now he is, because now he sees the true value of Jesus. In Luke, it talks about him being a good and righteous man who was not, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. It also talks about him not having been at the Sanhedrin trial of Jesus. He was not consenting to the death of Jesus. And we know that the trial, it was a unanimous verdict. So he was not one of those who was called in the small hours of the morning to come and stand trial against Jesus. And we know from John that he was not alone. Let's go to John. Let's read this from John. John chapter 19, it's verse 38. Now after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but one secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate granted him permission. In one of the other Gospels it says that Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. As I say, the Romans were quite good at keeping you alive as long as possible. He actually sent a message to the centurion to ask if Jesus was dead, which the centurion confirmed. And Pilate, that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate granted permission, and he came therefore and took away the body. And Nicodemus came also, who had first come to him by night, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds in weight. Now that's a lot of perfume and things. So here's Nicodemus, who also was, if you like, a secret disciple, coming out into the open now that Jesus had gone. And both men undoubtedly would at this point be made to suffer, because undoubtedly the priests would like to see Jesus' body thrown into an unmarked pauper's grave. But now they are taking Jesus and they are openly respecting. And remember, both of these men are Pharisees. Often when we hear the word Pharisee, we think they were all evil, all hypocritical. They were not. They were good, honest men amongst them. And here we have two of them. And I also find it quite amusing. It says that the women were looking on when they buried Jesus. Here's these two men. One of them brings along 100 pounds of spices to anoint the body and to wrap him up and to put him in the tomb and to look after him. But then the ladies actually go and prepare their own stuff, because obviously the men's wasn't good enough. Because we all know, gentlemen, that what we do can be looked down upon. Now, I might be being silly here, but it just slightly amuses me, I'm afraid, at this point. So the ladies all go home and they prepare their spices to bring back and do the proper job later on. And at this point, the tomb is sealed up. A stone is rolled across the front of the tomb. But the Sanhedrin and the high priests are not finished with Jesus yet. If we go to Matthew 27. And it's verse 62. This is another thing I find slightly amusing. Now, on the next day, which is one of the preparations, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together to Pilate. So this is obviously towards the end of the day that Jesus was crucified, and said to him, "Sir." Earlier on, they were trying to blackmail him into doing their work, but now they want something else out of him. So they're coming back here, "Sir, please. We remember what was he said when he was alive, that deceiver, that after 3 days he said, 'I will rise again.'" It's interesting they say that there, which means they must have understood what Jesus said about destroying the temple and bringing it back and rebuilding it in 3 days. They understood what Jesus meant by that, but yet they were willing to accept false testimony on that side. "Therefore, give orders that the grave be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come and steal them away and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' And the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard, go and make it secure as you know how." And they went away to the grave and secured it. Along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. So Pilate at this stage hands over a Roman guard, which could have been up to 16 men. And they have the job now of standing there for 3 days. Also, to seal up a tomb, the stone would have been rolled over the front. And what they would do is run ropes over this stone, attached to the walls on the side. And they would have put either clay or wax seals on the stone itself to the ropes, and impressed a seal on it. If it was the Roman seal, then the law was if you broke a Roman seal without permission, it was death. And nobody would be able to move that stone now without the seals actually being broken. Galatians 3. So chapter 3, verse 13 and 14. This is one of the reasons they wanted Jesus taken down on the Sabbath, by the way. "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, being become a curse for us. For as it is written, cursed is everybody who hangs on a tree, in order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith." This was one of the reasons that the priest went to Pilate to have him removed. They wanted the bodies removed, and they wanted it got rid of as quickly as possible. And it was because that anybody who was hung on a tree was counted as being cursed. It's what you'd hang the body up, like you'd hang the body of a pirate up or something like that. It was a curse. That is one of the reasons they wanted to get them off the cross as quickly as possible, and they wanted to get them underground as quickly as possible, especially as the next day was a Sabbath. And that is important. The next day was a Sabbath. It's one of the Jewish feasts. It's a weekly Jewish feast, if you like. Let's go to Genesis and let's see what God says about the Sabbath. So now Jesus is in the tomb. It's chapter 2. It's verse 1 to 3. "Thus the heavens and the earth were complete. It is finished. And all their hosts. And by the 7th day God had completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day, for all his work was done. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because he rested from all the work which God had created and done." It is finished. And here Jesus is resting. Okay, it's in a tomb, sealed up with a guard on the front so that none of his enemies, if you like, can get to him now. It is finished. A Sabbath day's rest. It could only have been the Sabbath after the day of Passover. In the law that God gave, even if it wasn't the actual Saturday itself the next day, the next day after the Passover was always a special Sabbath. So one way or the other, the day after the Passover was a Sabbath. So Jesus rested from all his work because it was finished, it was completed, and it was good. One last feast happens this week, and this is the last thing. The Feast of First Fruits. Now, in the book of Leviticus we read earlier on, the Feast of First Fruits always happens in the week of unleavened bread on the day after the Sabbath. And you've got to remember, from the Jewish reckoning, the day after the Sabbath actually starts at sunset. So they go from sunset to sunset for their days. So the day after the Sabbath would actually have been after sunset on the Saturday. So between sunset Saturday and sunrise on a Sunday. And this is when the Feast of First Fruits happens. And in the instructions God gave, they were to go out into the fields, to cut down a sheaf of wheat, to bring it to the temple, and to wave it before God. And that was the first fruits of the harvest. And nobody was allowed to collect the harvest until that had been done. By the time of Jesus, of course, they'd added a whole load of other instructions to it. And what would tend to happen is at sundown on the Sabbath, there would then be a torchlight procession out to the fields outside Jerusalem. And the priests would lead the way. And it would be like a sort of celebration almost. And you can imagine the local farmers would all have chosen their best bit of wheat in their field, and they'd have bundled it all up together and tied it up nicely. And the priest would go up to a certain sheaf of wheat that was all ready, and they would say to the crowd, "Is this one good enough?" And apparently it was a bit of almost like a game, and they would shout, "No, that's rubbish, that one, we don't like that one." And then they would go on to another one, and they'd do the same. And apparently the tradition is normally by the third one, the priest had got bored of it, and they wanted to get on with it. And so they'd all shout out, "Yes, the third one's good enough." And at that stage, they would ceremonially cut the sheaf of wheat and process back up into Jerusalem. All this is done at night by torch. And then in the temple, that sheaf of wheat would be threshed in a certain way, separated out. It would then be, the flour would then be ground. They would then sieve it at least 10 times, I believe, to get it as fine and pure as they possibly could. And then at some stage of the night, when this has all been done, it would be taken and handfuls of it would be thrown onto the altar as a sacrifice. It would be raised up to God in a bowl, and then handfuls of it would be thrown onto the sacrifice. Let's go to Corinthians 15. First book of Corinthians, 15. It's verse 20. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20. "But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. For since by a man came death, by a man also came resurrection from the dead. For as Adam died, all died, so also in Christ all shall be made alive." At some stage during that night, as it were, the dark hours of Sunday morning, in the temple, that bowl of flour, that first fruit flour, that perfect, that fine flour would have been raised up to God as a first fruits offering. Some stage in those dark hours of Sunday morning, Jesus raised from the dead. He passed through the grave clothes and he left the tomb. So the first fruit festival that was happening in the temple, in the grave, the first fruits of the dead were being raised, and Jesus Christ came back to life. We shall leave it there for this week. Shall we pray? Lord, you know all things. You knew from the beginning what would happen. And yet you were willing. Lord Jesus, you were willing to take your place on that cross, to take the wrath for me. Lord, all we can say is thank you. Amen.